They didn't even look at me when they told me to leave. My father's eyes were locked on my younger brother, full of admiration, while my mother nodded as if my exile had been discussed long before I even walked into the room. Before I go deeper, if you love shocking family betrayal stories and ultimate revenge, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment your thoughts. It helps me share more of these unbelievable stories with you. I grew up believing the same thing every child is taught, that parents love their children equally. That no matter how different siblings are, love is supposed to be shared, not measured. But in my family, that rule never existed. There was always one golden child. And it was never me. Daniel, my younger brother, was born 3 years after me, and from the very moment he arrived, my mother treated him as if he were a miracle. Don't get me wrong, I adored him when we were little. I used to sneak into his room just to make sure he was sleeping soundly. I'd let him have my toys, I'd sit by him when he was scared, and I defended him when older kids picked on him. I was his protector, his shadow, his first fan. But as the years went by, I started noticing something I couldn't ignore. No matter what Daniel did, throwing tantrums, lying, failing a class, even breaking things, my parents brushed it off. He was their little star, their pride, their chosen one. And me? I had to be perfect just to be noticed. If I scored a B on a test, my father would frown and ask why it wasn't an A. If I stayed home instead of going out, my mother would sigh and tell me I was boring. Nothing I did was ever enough. Meanwhile, Daniel could bring home a crayon drawing, and they'd put it on the fridge like it was a masterpiece. By high school, the favoritism was undeniable. I stopped expecting recognition. I poured myself into work and studies instead, thinking maybe success would change their minds. I got straight A's, joined clubs, even worked part-time to cover things they said we couldn't afford. Funny how money was tight whenever I needed something, but Daniel never went without. He had new sneakers every season, the latest gaming consoles, a phone upgrade every year. If he wanted it, they found a way. If I asked, I was told to be understanding. That word haunted me. By the time I made it to college, I was used to being invisible. I pushed myself hard, earned scholarships, and never asked for a single cent from them. My parents saved every dollar for Daniel's future, while mine was built on my own blood and sleepless nights. When graduation day came, the proudest moment of my life, I thought, maybe, just maybe, they would show up. I had worked for this more than anything else in my life. I looked into the audience as I walked across the stage, diploma in hand, scanning for their faces. The chair where they were supposed to sit was empty. Later, I found out why. They were at one of Daniel's basketball games. Not a championship. Not a final. Just another routine game. That was more important than watching their firstborn graduate. I smiled for pictures with strangers that day. On the inside, though, something broke. Still, I didn't give up. I landed a stable job after graduation, nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills. I moved into a small apartment, paid rent on time, cooked my own meals, and saved little by little. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And for once, I felt independent. Meanwhile, Daniel drifted from one failure to another. He dropped out of community college after one semester, complaining that school was a scam. He decided to become an entrepreneur. His ventures were laughable: an online clothing store, a car flipping scheme, a crypto obsession. Each one failed spectacularly. Each time, my parents bailed him out. He just needs a chance, they'd say. He had more chances than most people get in a lifetime. And yet, it was never enough. Then came the Sunday afternoon that changed everything. I went home expecting dinner, maybe small talk. Instead, I walked into the living room to find my father sitting rigid on the couch, Daniel beside him with a smug grin, and my mother pacing as though a decision had already been made. "We need to talk," my mother said, her tone sharp. I sat down, unease growing in my chest. That's when they told me. They had decided I should move out of my apartment and let Daniel live there. He needed a stable place to rebuild his life. Since I was doing well for myself, it was only fair to give it up. I laughed at first, waiting for the punchline. But their faces didn't change. Family sacrifices for each other, my father said coldly. You'll manage, my mother added, as if that was supposed to comfort me. And Daniel? He leaned back, grinning like a king who'd just been crowned. The truth hit me in that moment. To them, I wasn't their child. I was a resource. A convenience. Someone to be drained whenever their golden boy demanded more. I fought back. I told them it was my lease, my bills, my hard work. But they didn't care. You'll understand when you're older, my mother said, dismissing me like a child even though I was in my mid-20s. Then came the final blow. If you don't do this, my father said, his voice sharp and final, don't bother coming back here again. The silence after those words was deafening. I left the house without another word, my chest heavy with every betrayal I'd ever endured. I sat in my car for hours, staring at the glow of their windows. For the first time in my life, I knew the truth. I wasn't part of their family anymore. Not really. But as the bitterness spread through me, another thought rose like fire. They wanted me gone. They thought I was weak. They thought they could erase me. But they didn't know me at all. Because I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The day Daniel moved into my apartment was the day I realized my parents hadn't just betrayed me, they had erased me. When I walked through the door after work, I found him already there. He was sprawled across my couch like a king, his sneakers on the armrest, sipping soda from the fridge I had stocked. A pile of his duffel bags sat against the wall. My wall. You should be grateful, he said casually, not even looking up from his phone. Mom and Dad say this is just temporary. Just until I get back on my feet. Temporary. The word tasted like ash. Because everything about the scene screamed permanence. My bedroom door was open, and I could see his clothes already spilling out of drawers. He hadn't even asked. He had simply claimed. I set my bag down slowly, my voice low. This is my place, Daniel. I pay the rent. I worked for this. You can't just. He finally looked at me then, smirking. Relax. You'll manage. You always do. Mom and Dad said you'd understand. That word again. Understand. I had been forced to understand my entire life. Understand why Daniel got the new clothes while mine came from thrift shops. Understand why my victories were ignored while his failures were celebrated. Understand why I was expected to sacrifice while he was allowed to take. But this time, I didn't understand. Not at all. For the first 2 nights, I slept on the couch while he sprawled in my bed. He stayed up late, blasting music, leaving trash in the kitchen, talking loudly on the phone about business ideas. My sanctuary had turned into a frat house, and I was a guest in my own life. By the 3rd night, I couldn't take it anymore. I called my parents, hoping for once they'd see reason. Mom, this isn't fair, I said, trying to steady my voice. It's my lease, my space. He can't just. Her tone cut me off, sharp and impatient. Stop being selfish. Your brother needs stability. You'll land on your feet, you always do. You're stronger than he is. That sentence hit me like a slap. My strength wasn't something they valued. It was something they exploited. Because I could endure, they felt justified in discarding me. I tried my father next. His response was colder. You'll do what's right for family. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I hung up numb. That night, I packed what I could carry. A suitcase of clothes, a box of essentials, my laptop. Everything else I left behind. My apartment, the one symbol of independence I had fought for, was gone. For a week, I stayed in a cheap motel. The kind where the walls were thin and the neon sign outside flickered all night. Lying there on the stiff mattress, staring at the stained ceiling, I replayed every moment of my life in that family. Every sacrifice I made, every time I was told Daniel needed more, every time I was invisible. And I realized something chilling. This wasn't just about Daniel needing help. This wasn't temporary. This was the new reality. They had chosen him. Completely. When I finally returned to the apartment to grab the rest of my things, the locks had already been changed. My name was still on the lease. My money had paid the deposits. But the key I held no longer worked. The door opened a crack, and there he was, smirking. Mom and Dad said it's better if you don't come back, he said casually, leaning against the frame. To avoid drama. I stared at him, my pulse pounding in my ears. You'll regret this, I whispered, my voice steady even as my hands trembled. He laughed in my face. Sure I will. Then he shut the door. The sound of the lock sliding into place might as well have been a nail in a coffin. I stood there in the hallway, my box of belongings digging into my arms, and felt something inside me snap. For years, I had endured. For years, I had played the part of the understanding child. But in that moment, all I felt was fire. They thought they could erase me. They thought I'd vanish quietly, a shadow easily replaced. But I wasn't going anywhere. I found a tiny basement studio across town. A single room with peeling paint, low ceilings, and barely enough space for a bed and a hot plate. It was damp in the corners and smelled faintly of mold, but it was mine. Mine in a way the apartment no longer was. And as I sat there night after night, surrounded by silence, I began to write things down. At first, it was just dates. The day I lost the apartment. The amounts I heard my parents had given Daniel. The rumors of debts he'd piled up. But soon, the notes grew. Pages filled with details of every business he started and failed. Every lie he told. Every expense that didn't add up. I wasn't sure what I was building at first. A record? A diary? Proof that I wasn't crazy? But deep down, I think I already knew. This wasn't just documentation. This was the beginning of a weapon. Because one day, when the golden child's throne began to crumble, all of this would matter. And when that moment came, I wouldn't just survive. I'd make sure every single one of them knew exactly what it meant to cast me out. I thought losing my apartment would be the end of it. I thought maybe once Daniel settled in, once he had what he wanted, I could finally breathe. But I was wrong. Taking my apartment wasn't enough for him. He wanted to wear my life like a crown. The first time I saw him after he moved in was at a family gathering, a cousin's birthday. I almost didn't go. Part of me couldn't stand the thought of sitting at a table with them, pretending nothing had happened. But another part of me hoped, foolishly, that maybe they would soften in front of the extended family. Maybe someone would notice the injustice. Instead, I walked into the living room and froze. Daniel was standing in the middle of it all, a drink in hand, surrounded by relatives. His voice carried across the room. Yeah, my place is nice, he boasted. Plenty of room to work on my business ideas. Mom and Dad said I deserve it, after everything I've been through. My place. My hard work. My sacrifice. And he spoke as if he had earned it. Worse. My parents nodded along. They smiled at him with pride, as though he had accomplished something monumental instead of stealing what wasn't his. When they noticed me, their faces barely changed. My mother gave a polite smile. My father offered a stiff nod. That was it. No warmth. No guilt. Nothing. But Daniel had been waiting for this. He turned, his smirk already in place. Hey, sis, he said loudly. How's the basement? The word dripped with mockery. A ripple of laughter spread through the room. A few relatives looked away, embarrassed, but the humiliation burned into me like acid. I clenched my fists under the table later, forcing myself to stay composed. It's fine, I said flatly. At least it's mine. For just a second, his smirk faltered. But then my mother cut in sharply. Don't start. Your brother is finally taking responsibility. You should be proud of him. Proud. Of what? Of stealing my apartment? Of squandering money and then being rewarded for it? The rest of the night was unbearable. Daniel bragged endlessly about his ventures, claiming he had meetings with investors and was networking with business contacts. Every word was a lie. But my parents ate it up, nodding like he was some visionary entrepreneur. By the time dessert came out, I could barely sit still. My father pulled me aside before I left, his tone low but stern. Don't ruin this for him, he said. Daniel needs encouragement, not criticism. Don't be selfish. Selfish. That word cut deeper than any insult. I had given up everything. I had endured every slight, every dismissal, every stolen opportunity. And still, I was the selfish one. I slipped out early, the sound of laughter chasing me down the driveway. I sat in my car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. They didn't see me as family anymore. To them, I was expendable. But as I sat there in the dark, one thought crystallized: I would never let them humiliate me like that again. The following weeks were quiet, but heavy. I avoided calls, ignored invitations, and buried myself in work. My studio was small, but it was peaceful compared to the chaos of being around them. Still, I couldn't escape the shadow of Daniel's reign. I heard about him constantly. Friends mentioned his new car one my parents had bought him. Relatives whispered about his parties. Social media mocked me with pictures of him posing in his apartment, drinks in hand, surrounded by people who fed his ego. At first, it felt like torture. But then something shifted. I began to notice the cracks. He was reckless, showing off money he didn't have, bragging about businesses that didn't exist. I overheard someone mention that he had borrowed money from a friend and hadn't paid it back. Another time, I heard he'd maxed out a credit card on business expenses that looked suspiciously like nights out. My parents didn't see it, or refused to. They covered for him, explained away his mistakes, and praised him for trying. But I saw it clearly. Daniel wasn't building anything. He was digging his own grave. And the thought of it kept me steady. Every time I scrolled past one of his smug posts online, every time I heard about another handout, I reminded myself, nothing built on lies lasts forever. He was playing king. But kings can fall. And when he did, I wouldn't just stand by and watch. I'd be ready. The basement studio was a box of shadows. The walls were stained with old water damage, the pipes above groaned through the night, and the single window let in just enough light to remind me what I didn't have anymore. But it was mine. It wasn't comfort, it was survival. At first, the silence pressed in like a weight. I had gone from the noise of family dinners, the background hum of a home I once thought I belonged in, to the loneliness of four walls that seemed to mock me. There were nights I sat at the edge of my bed with my head in my hands, wondering how I'd become disposable to the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. But here's the thing about isolation: it can either break you or forge you into something harder. And slowly, it began to forge me. Work became my lifeline. I picked up overtime shifts, stayed late whenever my boss asked, and volunteered for tasks nobody else wanted. The extra hours left me exhausted, but exhaustion was better than lying awake in the dark with my thoughts. My paycheck grew, little by little. I tightened my spending, ate cheap meals, and tucked away every dollar I could. Every bit of savings felt like proof that I was stronger than what they had done to me. Proof that I could build without them, survive without them. Meanwhile, Daniel's empire of entitlement grew louder. Even when I tried to ignore him, his presence seeped in. Friends mentioned spotting him driving a shiny car my parents had bought. Relatives whispered about the parties at his place. Social media made it worse. Photos of him in my old apartment, throwing his head back in laughter, bottles of alcohol scattered across the table. He captioned one picture: "Work hard, play harder." Work hard? The irony almost made me laugh. I scrolled through those images late at night, my studio dark except for the glow of my phone screen, and felt anger coil tighter inside me. Every smirk, every careless gesture, every false display of success, each one pushed me further from pain and closer to something else. Resolve. I realized I couldn't just sit in the shadows and endure anymore. If I kept letting them trample me, there would be nothing left. That was when I started keeping track. At first, it was almost by instinct. I wrote down the day my parents forced me out, the money I heard they gave him, the things I noticed when I dropped by to pick up the rest of my belongings. But soon the notes grew longer. Whenever I overheard relatives mentioning another one of Daniel's ventures, I jotted it down. When someone casually complained that he owed them money, I wrote that too. I even began saving screenshots of his social media posts, his bragging, his investments, his parties. At first, it felt obsessive. Why was I documenting every failure of my brother, every betrayal of my parents? But as the notebook filled, I realized it wasn't just proof of my pain. It was something sharper. A weapon. I began to be deliberate. If I bumped into people who knew him, I asked subtle questions. How's Daniel doing? I'd say, feigning casual interest. And people always had stories. The loan he hadn't repaid. The favor he'd promised and never delivered. The scheme that failed before it even began. Every scrap of information went into my notes. And I kept going. I started building folders on my laptop, carefully labeled. Financial rumors. Failed ventures. Evidence of reckless spending. Copies of things tied to my parents, too, their names on certain documents, their transfers to cover his losses. Piece by piece, I was creating a map of his downfall. I didn't know exactly how I'd use it yet. But I knew one thing. I wasn't collecting these scraps for nothing. The longer I kept track, the calmer I felt. While Daniel boasted online and my parents paraded him around as their pride and joy, I knew the truth. His life was built on sand. And sand can collapse in an instant. One night, after a grueling 12-hour shift, I sat in my tiny room staring at the piles of notes spread across my table. It looked chaotic, but to me it was the clearest picture I had ever seen of my family's truth. Daniel wasn't a star. He wasn't a genius entrepreneur. He was a reckless child who had been coddled into adulthood. And my parents weren't just blind. They were complicit. They had stolen from me to build his throne. But in their arrogance, they had handed me everything I needed to tear it down. I leaned back in my chair that night, exhaustion heavy in my bones, but a new kind of fire alive in my chest. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was preparation. Because sooner or later, the golden child would stumble. And when he did, I wouldn't be caught off guard. I would be waiting. And this time, I wouldn't just watch his fall. I would make sure it happened. The phone call came on a Wednesday evening, just as I was kicking off my shoes after a 12-hour shift. I was exhausted, my back aching, but the moment I saw my mother's name flash across the screen, I knew something was wrong. She didn't call unless she wanted something. I debated letting it go to voicemail, but a bitter curiosity won out. Hello. Her voice was unusually sweet. Honey, how are you? Working hard, I imagine. You always do. I almost laughed at the performance. She never asked about me. Not really. I'm fine, I said cautiously. What's going on? A pause. Then, in that tone she used when she was about to deliver a favor, she said, Your father, and I wanted to talk to you about something important. It's about your brother. Of course it was. I sank into the one rickety chair in my studio. What about Daniel? Well, she hesitated, then lowered her voice. He has a new opportunity. Something big this time. A real business deal, not like the others. But he needs a loan. And since your credit is good. I cut her off. No. The silence on the other end stretched. Then her voice sharpened. You don't even know the details. I don't need to. I'm not co-signing anything for Daniel. He's your brother, she snapped, the sweetness gone. Family helps each other. I clenched my jaw, anger bubbling. Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't throw one child out to make room for another. You chose him. You made your decision. Don't come to me now. Before she could reply, my father's voice thundered into the phone. Listen here. We've given you everything. I couldn't stop the bitter laugh that escaped. Everything? You gave it all to him. And now you want me to risk my future so he can fail again? Absolutely not. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. For a moment, I imagined them staring at each other in shock, realizing for the first time that I wasn't bending anymore. My father's voice dropped low, Icy. If you turn your back on your brother now, don't expect us to forgive you. You'll regret it. No, I said, my voice steady. The only regret I have is ever thinking I mattered to you. I hung up. My hands trembled as I set the phone down, not from fear but from adrenaline. That call had severed something final. Whatever fragile tie I had to them snapped in that moment. They hadn't just betrayed me. They had declared war. Over the next week, the fallout came fast. My mother left messages, alternating between guilt trips and rage. He's your brother. How could you abandon him? One day, followed by, you're cold and selfish, you've always been jealous, the next. I didn't answer. Not once. Then the texts came from Daniel himself. At first, they were smug. You'll cave. You always do. Don't be so bitter. I'll make sure you get paid back. When I didn't respond, they turned venomous. You're pathetic. No wonder Mom and Dad don't want you around. Enjoy your basement, loser. I'm building an empire while you rot. I stared at those words late one night, my notebook open on the desk beside me, and felt something click into place. All this time, I had been documenting out of pain, out of desperation to make sense of the betrayal. But now, with each threat, each insult, I saw the truth more clearly. I wasn't just collecting memories. I was collecting weapons. My parents thought I was selfish. Daniel thought I was powerless. What none of them realized was that while they had been busy discarding me, I had been preparing. 2 weeks later, I heard through a relative that Daniel's big deal had already collapsed. He had borrowed money from 3 different people, promising returns, but had nothing to show. My parents were scrambling to cover him, dipping into savings they couldn't afford to lose. I should have felt satisfaction. But instead, I felt something sharper. Opportunity. I began organizing my files more carefully. Names of creditors. Dates of failed ventures. Records of my parents' involvement, transfers, payments, favors. Every thread leading back to Daniel, every rope he had tied around himself. And with each new entry, my resentment cooled into something more dangerous than rage. Patience. Because now I understood the truth. Revenge didn't come from shouting, from slamming doors, from trying to convince people who had already decided you were worthless. Revenge came from silence. From watching. From waiting. And when the time was right, from striking in a way they could never recover from. That night, I sat at my desk, my notebook stacked neatly beside me, and stared at the single sentence I had scrawled across the top page weeks earlier. They made me nothing. I added another line beneath it, my pen pressing hard into the paper. I'll make sure they lose everything. For the first time since they had cast me out, I smiled. Because I finally knew what I had to do. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. I prefer to think of it as a construction project, long, patient, and engineered to collapse at exactly the right moment. After the cosign demand and my decision to walk away, I stopped reacting and started building. Quietly. Precisely. With purpose. For weeks I lived like a ghost in my own life. I kept the day job, picked up extra shifts, and spent every spare hour on research. Not the kind of research you do for a paper. This was forensic. Names, dates, transactions, habits. I learned to read the spaces between what people said and what they did. I mapped out Daniel's debts, the people he owed, and the favors my parents had promised him. I followed breadcrumbs. A text a neighbor let slip, an offhand comment at a funeral, a forwarded bank receipt that landed in the wrong inbox. Nothing was insignificant. I opened accounts in pseudonyms, nothing illegal, just careful, an email here, a burner phone number there. I didn't need to hide from the law. I needed to hide my intent from a family that would otherwise sniff out any attempt to push back. The last thing I wanted was for them to see me coming and bolt. My weapon would be timing and truth. My notebook, once a jumble of wounded scribbles, became a blueprint. I organized everything into sections. Money in, funds my parents transferred to Daniel, money out, how he spent it, promises broken, people he'd stiffed, and paper trails, receipts, screenshots, posts. I digitized what I could, created backups, encrypted folders. The more I cataloged, the clearer the pattern, a steady siphoning of financial and emotional capital from my life into theirs. I also started meeting people. Quietly. First, a woman who worked at a small accounting firm. She helped me understand how transfers and gifts could be traced and what documents meant in legal terms. Then a paralegal friend who had once handled estate disputes. She taught me the language of property and liability and how small omissions in paperwork could become leverage. I was polite, guarded, presenting myself as someone curious about financial literacy, nothing more. Trust built slowly. People misjudge a basement dweller. They underestimate how much time someone has to learn. At the same time, I cultivated sources close to Daniel. One of his old friends, someone who'd once lent him money, started leaving voicemails venting about being stiffed. I let those voicemails accumulate. A bartender who'd served Daniel at a party became a casual messenger, relaying the names of people Daniel claimed to partner with. Little windows into a chaos he wanted hidden. I listened without comment, filed every name. I watched my parents too, not like a scorned daughter prowling their house, but like an engineer studying a structure's load points. My mother had a weakness for charity events. She bragged about them online and loved donor lists that read well. My father preferred the veneer of respectability, civic clubs, lunches with men who liked to throw money into helpful causes. Both loved appearances. Both preferred applause to scrutiny. Those tendencies were soft targets. One night, leafing through an old family ledger my father misplaced, it had his initials on the corner and a faded list of transfers. I found a series of entries that made my chest go cold. Transfers from his account to accounts linked to Daniel's startups, small sums at first, then bigger, and finally a lump sum that matched the deposit for my apartment months earlier. It wasn't an accident. They'd taken money that in truth could be traced back to funds my father had promised me years ago. Money my grandparents had left in a separate account that, for reasons left unclear, my father had moved around. I copied every page, photographed every line, and stored the images in 3 different places. I took a breath and realized the scale of what I held. This wasn't just favoritism anymore. This was financial misdirection. It was a pattern of feeding one child at the expense of another's future. It was criminal negligence, maybe worse. And it was proof. That proof changed the calculus. If before I'd been collecting scraps for a future argument, now I had leverage. Not just moral leverage, legal and social leverage too. In the hands of the right people, that ledger could unravel every excuse my parents had used to justify their behavior. But leverage without precision is noise. I needed a plan that would do more than humiliate. It had to be surgical. I sketched scenarios, quietly tipping off a creditor when the timing was right, delivering documents to a lawyer who specialized in family financial disputes, using social proof to expose their enabling in a way my parents couldn't smooth over with community charm. I spent nights imagining the dominoes falling and what order would produce the most damage: a creditor's demand, a public ripple through the club where my father sat on the board, an embarrassed donor list with the truth beside it. I didn't want to destroy them entirely. Destroy is a childish word. I wanted justice to match the theft, measured, inevitable, impossible to argue away. I wanted them to face consequences that made them understand the cost of picking a golden child over a child who earned everything. Not vengeance for vengeance's sake, but restitution that would put things back, as far as possible, to where they should have been. So I kept building. I reached out to a young investigative journalist who had written about small-town embezzlement and did it carefully, sending only questions at first. The journalist's curiosity was immediate. She asked for documents. I sent anonymized copies, redacting names but preserving dates and amounts. Her interest went from casual to serious. She asked to meet. I declined. For now, she was a tool. If and when the story required public light, she would give it. At home, I learned to be patient like a predator. I ate cheap meals, saved more than I needed, and rehearsed my next moves. The mundane tasks of life, paying bills, grocery shopping, answering work emails, felt calmer now because each was a brick in the foundation I was building. And in the quiet hours, when exhaustion softened into resolve, I allowed myself a small, private thought. They had built their lives on my labor and my silence. They had treated me as expendable. So I would become the architect of a consequence they couldn't ignore. Not loud. Not dramatic. Precise. Cold as the ledger pages I'd photographed. They always called him golden, like it was a birthright. But gold tarnishes. It bends. It breaks when you put weight on it. I watched that happen in slow motion, and the more it crumbled, the clearer my path became. The first real crack I noticed wasn't dramatic. It was a quiet thing, a missed payment notice that floated through my aunt's conversation at a barbecue, folded into a sentence about how Daniel owed someone a lot. It landed in my ears like a splinter. Then another splinter. A neighbor's offhand remark about how my parents had sold a family heirloom to cover a sudden debt. A week later, the friend who'd once lent Daniel a small sum admitted over coffee that she'd never been repaid and didn't expect to be. It could have been coincidence. It wasn't. It was a pattern. A slow, clumsy collapse that my parents could no longer hide, and they were panicking in the only way they knew how, by throwing good money after bad and pretending the world would applaud their sacrifice. They began selling things. First, small items. The antique clock my grandmother used to wind on Sundays, a set of silverware that used to gleam at holiday dinners. My mother posted pictures of charity events and wrote long captions about generosity, while quietly letting pieces of our past slip away. My father, who had always liked the impression of stability more than its substance, started staying late at the Civic Club, working to cover embarrassment with appearances. And Daniel? He continued to laugh and post and promise. His posts grew more desperate in tone. Big move incoming, investor talks, trust the process. But the people who'd once boosted his image were beginning to hear the true rhythm beneath the bravado. Creditors calling, whispers at the end of bar counters, friendships frayed by unpaid debts. I watched all of this like someone studying termites eating through a beam. My notebook filled faster than ever. Each sale my parents made, every awkward excuse at a family dinner, every creditor's name that slipped into conversation, it all went into my files. I cross-referenced bank dates with social posts, matched transfers to receipts, and looked for the weak joints where pressure would make everything split. One afternoon, a neighbor I'd once helped with a broken lawnmower stopped me on the street. "You still seeing your folks?" she asked, tentative. I said no, casually. She lowered her voice. "They're worried, honey. Been selling things. Heard your dad got into some trouble with the Civic Club funds, but I don't know." She glanced around and added, almost to herself, "Everything's been odd." Oddness became opportunity. My pulse quickened when I walked away. Civic Club funds. That was a lever. My father loved those lunches and the little checks that made him look generous. If someone looked closely at the books, it wouldn't take much to find discrepancies, or at least uncomfortable questions. My hand hovered over my phone, but I didn't call anyone. Patience. Precision. A different opening came from Daniel's own arrogance. He spoke loudly about plans and partners to anyone who would listen, and the more he spoke, the more he revealed. At a wedding I attended reluctantly, he cornered a man from our town who'd once been an investor in a small startup. Daniel boasted about a deal the man had signed on to. The man's smile vanished. It later turned into an email to me, not threatening, but curious. "Is Daniel involved in anything legitimate?" He mentioned my name. That email felt like a knock at the right door. I replied with careful honesty, not exposing anything that couldn't be backed by documents, but hinting that there were missing pieces. The man thanked me and said he'd look into it. I didn't push. I let him move and watched as he began to ask questions of his own. The pressure we were applying, soft, invisible, wasn't dramatic, but it was effective. People who had been willing to overlook Daniel's theatrics were suddenly more cautious once they suspected their names were involved. Investors who'd been flattered by his charm started asking for records. A landlord who'd once let Daniel slide on rent told a mutual acquaintance he was considering legal action. Meanwhile, my parents' panic pushed them into worse decisions. They mortgaged something I'd thought untouchable, the old family house. They told themselves it was temporary, an act of faith, but handing over titles and neighbors' trust ripped at the social fabric that had always protected them. My mother cried at the kitchen table one night when a bank rep came by, and for the first time I saw fear in her eyes, the same fear they had aimed at me when they told me to leave. That fear made them sloppy. In an effort to patch holes, my father signed forms without reading. My mother authorized transfers with hands that trembled. Those signatures, those hurried approvals, made the ledger I'd photographed earlier look like a roadmap to everything they had tried to hide. A turning point came when Daniel, drunk on bravado, called an old creditor in front of a mutual friend and promised to pay back in full this month. The creditor laughed and told him outright that if he didn't see money, he'd escalate. That escalation meant court. That meant subpoenas. That meant exposure. Daniel laughed it off, But when a man who collects debt starts telling friends he'll sue, that is not bluff. That is a threat. I began to see timelines, how long before a particular creditor would send a demand letter, how quickly an investor would pull out if documentation wasn't provided, and how the civic club would react when the first uncomfortable question landed at a board meeting. I made a map of these timelines. Each map became a plan. I also tweaked my outward behavior. I was careful not to appear vindictive or excited. When relatives asked if I wanted to get involved, as if I cared about saving Daniel, I stayed measured. "I'm busy," I said. "I have work." And I did. Work kept me honest, provided a cover. But at night, I watched the timeline progress like someone checking an oven, waiting for the precise moment a cake is done. Sometimes the cruelty of watching people crumble made me sick. There were still memories. My mother's hand smoothing my hair when I was little, my father praising a school project. Those memories were real, and the pain of turning those into instruments of consequence was not lost on me. But the ledger, the missed payments, the mortgaged house, those were the facts. They had made this choice. They had built their safety on my labor. When the first creditor sent a formal demand, it was anticlimactic. Daniel called my parents in a panic. My mother's voice echoed in my head from an old recording, "We'll fix this." But what could they fix? The tide had turned. The civic club started asking questions. Conversations once hushed in living rooms began to happen in offices and on encrypted calls. My father's name was murmured in places that mattered. I didn't gloat. I watched, steady as a camera on a tripod. The throne they'd built wobbled. The golden sheen dulled. Each person who finally asked a direct question tightened the schedule I had mapped in my head. The collapse wasn't instant. It was a series of tiny failures, 100 small fractures aligning until the structure had no support left. And all the while, I waited for the right sequence. The creditor's demand, the civic club meeting, the investor's withdrawal, to intersect in a way that would make it impossible for them to smooth over with charm, apologies, or charity galas. Because in the end, appearances had protected them for years. This time, truth would be louder than their applause. For a long time, I thought I had already endured the worst. Losing my apartment, being cut off, watching Daniel live like a king on the back of my sacrifices. I believed that was the peak of betrayal. But betrayal has layers. And sometimes, the deepest one hides in the very foundations of what you thought was yours. It happened on a rainy Thursday night. I was sorting through old folders I'd kept in a storage box, papers from college, tax returns, random envelopes my parents had shoved at me years ago. Most of it was useless clutter. But then I found an old bank statement, yellowed at the edges, with my name on it. My stomach dropped when I read the header, College Fund Savings Account. I had forgotten about it. My grandparents had set it up before they passed away, a small account intended to help me through school. My parents had always insisted it wasn't much and got absorbed into other expenses. I'd believed them. After all, they never gave me a cent for college. I worked 3 jobs and lived off scholarships. But here, in my hands, was proof that the account had existed. The balance wasn't huge, but it was more than enough to have eased my burden back then. More than enough to cover the months when I skipped meals to pay for textbooks. And it was gone. Not spent on me. Not spent on school. The transactions told the story clearly. Withdrawals lined up perfectly with the dates of Daniel's so-called ventures. The online clothing store. The failed car flipping scheme. Even one large chunk pulled the same week he had bragged about investing in crypto. My grandparents had left that money for me. My parents had signed it away for him. I sat there, the rain tapping against the small window of my basement studio, and felt something inside me calcify. This wasn't favoritism anymore. This wasn't even neglect. This was theft. And it wasn't just Daniel's arrogance or my parents' blindness. It was collusion. A quiet decision to rob one child to feed another. I went digging. I pulled out every document I had photographed from my father's misplaced ledger, cross-referenced every withdrawal, every signature. Piece by piece, the truth revealed itself. Not only had my parents funneled money into Daniel's endless failures, but they had also done it using resources that were supposed to be mine. Savings. Inheritance. Even small bonds in my name that had been liquidated without a word. I had thought the ledger was incriminating enough before. But now? Now it was devastating. It was proof that my parents hadn't just chosen Daniel over me. They had built him up with pieces of my future. And all those years they'd told me to understand? This was what they had been hiding. I didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, I felt a strange calm wash over me. The kind that comes when grief hardens into clarity. I knew then that revenge wasn't just an option. It was a responsibility. Not just for me, but for the truth my grandparents had entrusted to me, the future they'd tried to secure for me, the sacrifices I'd made believing my struggles were mine alone. No, they weren't mine alone. They were engineered. And the ones who engineered them were about to learn what it felt like to watch everything you'd built come crashing down. That weekend, I went back to my files with a new intensity. Every receipt, every withdrawal, every transfer now had sharper meaning. I organized them meticulously, creating timelines that connected Daniel's boasts to my parents' funding. At one point, I opened Daniel's old social media posts alongside the bank statements. There it was, the week he posted a photo in flashy sneakers, captioned "Boss Moves Only." That same week, a withdrawal drained the last of my college fund. The evidence was undeniable. I thought back to graduation day, standing in my cap and gown, scanning the crowd for faces that never showed. My parents had been at Daniel's basketball game instead. Now I understood why they hadn't come. They were never invested in me. They had already cashed me out. With every new revelation, the anger sharpened, but so did the plan. Because revenge, I realized, wasn't just about Daniel's downfall. It was about exposing the entire system that had enabled him. My parents had believed they were untouchable, protected by appearances and excuses. But once this truth came out, appearances would mean nothing. They had stolen from their own child. That stain doesn't wash out. Late one night, as I sat surrounded by documents, I whispered to myself, "They made me nothing." Then I added, louder, "Now I'll make them nothing." And for the first time, I knew exactly how. They taught me to swallow my anger and smile when the world leaned on me. I learned a different lesson in the months that followed. It's better to move quietly, like water under ice, until pressure finds a crack. Everything I had gathered, the ledger photos, the bank statements, the screenshots, the testimonials, was organized not for a rant, but for a sequence. I didn't want spectacle, I wanted consequence. Loud theatrics would let them spin the story, cry on camera, play the victim. Quiet facts, delivered in the right order, would be undeniable. So I began striking in ways that made sense for the truth I held. The first move was small and legal. I sent an anonymous packet to a creditor I knew had been stiffed by Daniel. The packet contained copies of bank statements showing transfers from my parents to accounts tied to Daniel's ventures, along with timestamped screenshots of Daniel's social media posts that correlated with the withdrawals. I didn't invent anything. I simply collected what already existed and made it legible to someone whose livelihood depended on getting paid. The letter did its job. The creditor, who had assumed he was one of many inconvenienced friends, forwarded the material to his attorney. That attorney, in turn, initiated a formal inquiry and sent a demand for repayment. When a demand arrives, people panic. When demands pile up, they scramble. Next, I contacted the small accounting firm I'd befriended months earlier, not with accusations, but with questions. I asked whether certain transfers between family accounts could be characterized as gifts, loans, or misuse. I asked how one would prove intent in court if paperwork didn't match the narrative. The answers were clinical and dry, but they told me what would hold up and what would not. I used that counsel to refine what I had and to prioritize what to release. Crucially, I reached out to the journalist I'd tested earlier, the one who wrote about quiet financial corruption in small towns. I didn't go on camera. I didn't schedule a dramatic sit-down. I provided her curated files, copies of statements, redacted to protect privacy where necessary, paired with a concise timeline tying the transfers to Daniel's ostentatious spending and my parents' sold assets. I let the journalist's instincts do the public work. Investigative reporting is not gossip. It's a spotlight that asks questions institutions would rather ignore. The piece she wrote was precise, and because it was sourced and fact-checked, it landed where it would hurt most: the Civic Club meeting minutes, the donor lists, the small-town paper's front page. Headlines don't forgive nuance. They demand accountability. When the story ran, it didn't scream vendetta. It presented numbers, dates, and public records. The club board called an emergency meeting. The bank asked for clarifications. Neighbors whispered, and the applause my parents loved so much started to fade. Simultaneously, I nudged others along their paths. An investor who had been listed in Daniel's boastful posts received a discreet email from me, not accusatory, but curious, with attachments showing mismatched claims. He checked, found no contracts, and withdrew his informal support. A landlord who had been lenient suddenly had counsel on standby. Little by little, the scaffolding of lies that had held Daniel's persona aloft was cut. Daniel reacted with the arrogance he always had at first. He posted angry defenses. He threatened legal action in the comments. He called my parents in the middle of the night, ranting that someone was out to ruin him. Their panic made them sloppy. They offered half explanations to the club and the paper, then contradictory statements. Banks require clarity. Civic groups require trust. Where those break, so does protection. One by one, the dominoes fell in the pattern I had mapped. Creditors stepped forward with formal complaints. The Civic Club, embarrassed, froze donations tied to my father. The charity gala my mother had planned had its headline donors reconsidering. My parents, once untouchable in social circles, were suddenly the subject of guarded conversations. I never sought revenge that would humiliate without cause. I wasn't interested in turning every private sorrow into public spectacle. My purpose was restitution and accountability. The ledger proved what had been taken from me. The public inquiries forced those who had hidden behind appearances to answer. There were moments when I feared I'd gone too far. I remember one evening standing across the street from their house, watching the porch light burn, and feeling an odd pang, half triumph, half grief. I thought of my mother's hands smoothing my hair as a child, of my father's pride at a school project. Those memories made the victory bittersweet. But when I imagined the years of small betrayals, the mornings I woke up hungry while my brother played with new toys, I felt the quiet steadiness of purpose return. Daniel's empire didn't collapse overnight, but in public it unraveled quickly. Partners withdrew. Loans were called. People who had once laughed at him now demanded answers. When legal notices arrived, he didn't post photos of defiance anymore. He posted silence. His bravado retreated into frantic phone calls and late-night searches for money. Where he had once pointed fingers, he now faced allegations. My parents scrambled to patch holes. My father signed paperwork to reassure the club. My mother issued an awkward public statement about family and forgiveness. Neither addressed the specifics. That omission mattered. Inquiries don't forgive silence, and silence becomes admission when the paper trail points elsewhere. There were practical consequences too. Notices for tax audits and creditor warnings appeared on their door. The house mortgage, taken out in part to prop up Daniel's false starts, became a pressure point banks did not ignore. The house that had always felt immovable wavered under this new heat. A neighbor who used to compliment my mother's casserole now avoided eye contact. People who had loudly stood by them now sounded like they were checking for an exit. Throughout it all, I stayed measured. I answered questions when asked by authorities. I provided documents when subpoenaed. I refused to be performative. The goal wasn't spectacle. It was truth landing on competent ears and letting institutions do what institutions do when given evidence: ask questions, demand answers, and, if necessary, seek restitution. The hardest part came when I received a call from a mediator representing one of the creditors. They wanted to speak with me, to see whether I'd be willing to testify to the transfers I'd documented. My throat tightened at the thought of sitting in a room with my parents under oath. But I said yes. If truth had weight, then my voice added it. When the first official hearing happened, a dry room with a long table, gray walls, and the faint hum of HVAC, my parents sat across from me. They looked small, not because of the chairs or the fluorescent light, but because the conversation had shrunk them to the size of the choices they'd made. My father's hands trembled. My mother's smile was gone. I spoke calmly. I recounted dates. I showed copies. No yelling, no dramatic pauses, only facts. Facts that showed a pattern they had tried to hide with charm and excuses. Walking out of that hearing, I felt an odd release. Not vindication exactly, but the relief of seeing things line up the way they should. Consequences were beginning to catch up to choices. The golden crown had slipped, the throne teetered. I hadn't wanted to watch them fall. I had wanted them to stop before the fall. But they had chosen their path. They had chosen Daniel. And they had done it with my future in their hands. Now, as the public inquiries multiplied and the legal timelines tightened, I waited for the final pieces to fall into place. Revenge, when it's justice in disguise, is patient. And I had learned patience. I used to think revenge would taste like fire, hot, burning, fierce. But when it finally came, it was cold. Crisp. Like the silence that follows a storm when everything broken lies exposed under the open sky. The collapse came quietly at first. The Civic Club announced my father was suspended pending an internal review. It was a single line in the town paper, but in our world, it was an earthquake. He'd built his identity on respectability, on being the man who could shake hands and smile his way through scrutiny. That smile didn't work anymore. Then the bank made its move. The mortgage they'd taken to prop up Daniel's failures was recalled. Payments weren't enough. The house I'd grown up in, the one place I thought was untouchable, was now property under threat. I learned this not from my parents, but from a public notice tacked on a courthouse board. I stood there reading it with a calm that surprised me. The golden child, of course, didn't take it quietly. Daniel spiraled. He called relatives, begging for money. He ranted online about betrayal, about being targeted. His posts grew erratic, screenshots of demand letters, long captions blaming haters. People stopped responding. The likes disappeared. One by one, the voices that used to cheer him on went silent. I didn't say a word, because by then, everything was already in motion. The creditors who'd been ignored for years finally had their day. The attorney I'd helped nudge along filed formal claims. With the evidence I'd quietly provided, they painted a picture not of an unlucky entrepreneur, but of a man enabled into fraud by a family desperate to protect him. And that picture stuck. When my parents sat in that sterile courtroom, forced to answer questions under oath, they finally faced what they had spent years avoiding. I watched my father's face go pale as the ledger was presented. I watched my mother's eyes drop when the college fund statements appeared, my name clear at the top, the withdrawals traced to Daniel's schemes. Their lawyer tried to soften it, called it poor judgment, family misunderstanding. But paper doesn't lie. Dates don't lie. And neither did I. I spoke calmly, clearly. I wasn't vengeful. I wasn't theatrical. I simply laid out the truth. The savings my grandparents had left for me, redirected without my consent. The inheritance chipped away to cover losses. The apartment I had paid for, handed to someone who'd never earned it. Every word tightened the noose of accountability. When it was over, the judgment was clear. Restitution. Debt repayment. Asset liquidation. My parents would lose the house. Daniel would face civil penalties and wage garnishments for years. And me? For the first time, I was no longer invisible. The court recognized what had been taken from me. What was left of the funds, frozen in accounts, was redirected back into my name. It wasn't everything, they'd squandered too much, but it was enough to matter. Enough to set me free. The day I signed the papers reclaiming what was mine, I drove past my old apartment. Daniel wasn't there anymore. He had already been evicted. The curtains were gone, the windows bare. For years, that place had been a symbol of what I lost. Now, it was just another empty box waiting for someone new. I didn't want it back. I didn't need it. Because I had built something else, something they couldn't touch. A life of my own. I didn't confront them afterward. I didn't scream, "I told you so," or parade my victory. That would have been too easy, too small for the years I'd endured. My revenge wasn't loud. It was the silence of absence. I cut off every tie, changed my number, moved to a new place, a better one. Started fresh, without their shadow looming over me. They had cast me out once. Now, I cast them out forever. People sometimes ask if I regret it, if I regret not trying to forgive, not trying to mend. But forgiveness requires remorse. They never offered any. Even at the end, I could see it in their eyes, the disbelief that their golden child had brought them ruin. They couldn't face the truth that it was their choices, not mine, that had destroyed everything. So no, I don't regret it. They made me nothing. And now, they have nothing. That balance is the only justice I ever wanted. And finally, I am free. If you followed this story all the way through, thank you. What do you think? Was the revenge justified? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more betrayal and revenge stories, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next twist.